My name is Asma Kazmi, and I'm a professor in the Art Practice Department and in the Berkeley Center for New Media. We're very pleased to host Charles Gaines's lecture in the Art and Design Monday series, which is a weekly series coordinated by the Office of Berkeley Art and Design in collaboration with over a dozen campus and Bay Area organizations, including the Berkeley Center for New Media, the Townsend Center, the School of Journalism, Art Practice, and many more. Berkeley Art and Design is led by Associate Vice Chancellor Shannon Jackson, and we're particularly grateful to the Art and Design Office for supporting the staff costs and space costs at the BAM-PFA so that we can host our amazing lectures in this beautiful space. I also want to add that today's lecture is generously funded or co-sponsored by the Department of African American Studies. Thank you so much for coming. Before I introduce Charles Gaines, I just want to mention the next two events that are coming up. Next week on October 8th, we have Kilani Nicole, who will be speaking about her new media curatorial practice. And the following Monday, on October 15th, the artist Carrie Tribe will speak about her work. Both events are on Monday in this space at the same time at 6:30 p.m. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker today, Charles Gaines. Many of you know Charles Gaines as one of the most important practitioners of conceptual art today. But I first met Charles in his other, yet equally distinguished role as a profoundly influential teacher at Cal Arts. In 2013, I got my first full-time academic job at Cal Arts, and I soon realized that Charles Gaines's role was pivotal in shaping the art program there. More broadly, too, his influence could be felt in so much of the work being made in the art world today. As an artist and an academic, I believe that art represents one of the most vivid sites for learning about history and culture, because the complex interchanges necessary to make images and objects make visible systems of oppression and exclusion. From Charles's example, I learned how I can model a teaching practice that is influenced by and responsive to historic and political contexts, and one that is rigorously committed to promoting social justice. Charles Gaines is known for his multi-layered works on paper and acrylic glass, photographs, drawings, musical compositions, and installations that explore aesthetics, authorship, and semantics. While embracing seriality and systems of the first-generation conceptualist, Charles Gaines's practice is groundbreaking in its recognition that even in the most clinical treatment of numbers, charts, and logical systems, an artwork is not objective. It's still infused with mainstream ideologies and is deeply embedded in the political. Charles Gaines is also a noted writer and a curator. His publications include The New Cosmopolitanism, published by the California State University Fullerton, and The Theater of Refusal, Black Art and Mainstream Criticism, published by the University of California, Irvine. The list of exhibitions on Charles Gaines's CV is extensive and highly distinguished. He has had more than 81 person shows and several hundred group exhibitions in the US and abroad, including the 2007 and 2015 Venice Biennale. In 2015, he presented a critically acclaimed retrospective exhibition at the Studio Museum in Harlem and the Hammer Museum. Gaines has received a US Artist Award, a Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship, and the 2015 College Art Association Artist Award for Distinguished Body of Work. And he is the 2018 honored recipient of the Red Cat Award. Please join me in welcoming Charles Gaines.
Thanks, Asma, and thanks for the invitation to speak here. I still can't get over the fact. It's been a long time since I've visited Berkeley. When I was teaching in Fresno, I used to come up here all the time. And then when I moved to LA, I stopped coming, actually. And so it was, it's been a long time. We drove past the old Berkeley University Museum that I remember, and I now found out that it's shut down because of some problems of it collapsing on top of people. This space, this side, is brand new to me, and so I'm very happy to get the chance to renew my acquaintance with Berkeley. What I want to do is to show two bodies of work. One is from what I refer to as grid work. These are the pieces that are based where I use systems and numbers and try to develop a way of constructing imagery and constructing representation through these systems in order to bypass what I would call my will and my intent, so that the body of work is produced by the system itself. And I'll get into a little explanation about what underlies that, what is responsible for that in a minute. The other body of work is work that I actually started around 1993, when I stopped focusing on grids and went into a focus on language and representation. My interest in language is very much the same as my interest in grids, that I was interested in particularly investigating syntactics. So I was interested in investigating the language system, but I was interested in investigating how that structure of language at that level informed meaning, and in that way was interested in how our social and cultural ideas become prominent, but also constrained by by our experiences. And so I'll in both systems, in both periods of work, my main interest was representation. That remained consistent, but how I approached the issue of representation changed. And I hope to get into that. Now, I have to warn you that, because I just gave a presentation in Ohio, and so 40 minutes went by before the first slide came up. So I promise you that's not going to happen today. But there is introduction to the work, because I have to explain what motivates what I do, and that explanation is useful because it helps focus on those things in the work that interest me, because there are many things that can be focused on, but this explanation helps to do that. And so, as you were told, that my interest is, I embrace the label of conceptual artists. My interest is specifically in the realm of systems and numbers, at least in the early work, and systems, numbers, and language. And I wound up doing that because I found that through using those strategies to produce imagery, that I could bypass what I call the issue of the creative imagination, that building artwork on the basis of the presumption that a work of art is actually a practice that's based in the expressive ego. And so I was interested in bypassing that notion of that one can make art that essentially was not built upon that assumption. And so I discovered, so that was later, but I just discovered early on that, like I say, something was wrong. When I went to graduate school, I sort of realized, I went there as a painter, I should let you know. But when I was doing paintings, when I was trying to do paintings, I realized that something was unsatisfying to me, that it wasn't meaningful to me to produce some idea. Well, here's the way I look at it: is that I was supposed that making art was about intuiting an idea and then expressing the idea on the canvas with respect to a painting, and then having some sense of satisfaction and belonging with respect to that. That I feel a kinship with whatever representation that's produced, because I felt that there was I would feel that there's a direct line between that representation and my subjectivity or my ego, or however you might describe it. But the problem I was having is that I couldn't get a sense that was happening. When I would make paintings, I felt unattached to them. And so this worried me, because I thought, because I was in graduate school at this point. I've been doing art for a long time, and am I going to discover at this point that I was in the wrong profession? And so I had no idea what I was going to do. What can you do with an art degree? It's just absolutely nothing. So I was a little concerned about that, and I thought, well, maybe I should figure out, so what's wrong, and maybe I thought that it's that. There's something about the act of painting, because this is operating within the sphere of painting. There's something about the act of painting that I was getting wrong. So I thought that I would do sort of an anthropological study and observe my peers. I was in a huge space with the RIT, Rutgers Institute of Technology, and I was in this huge space where all of the graduate studios were. I mean, there were actually cubicles. And so we all could see each other working. So I thought that I would do a kind of Margaret Mead kind of thing and get a notebook and maybe even some binoculars and observe the way other people were doing. So I could then maybe figure out something. So I did. I watched my comrades paint. They asked me what the hell I was doing there, standing with a notebook. But I watched them and took notes and then figured out that, well, maybe my problem was performative. Maybe it's the reason I wasn't feeling attached to my product is because I wasn't performing painting properly. So from my notes, I sat down and figured out how to perform better, which meant that I set a canvas on the easel. You know what an easel is out there? Yeah. And that displays my age. I should be careful about that. But I put a canvas on the easel, and then I sat in the chair about 20 feet from it and put my hand and my chin in my hand, crossed my leg, and contemplated. Or at least I went through and then so I just sat there until something happened, and then I was surprised because a thought came into my head. I was like really excited. So I ran up to the canvas and made a mark, and I went back and sat down and thought that it didn't work. Yeah, and then later on, I thought that maybe I wasn't getting in touch with my feelings properly. And so this was even after I got out of graduate school, a few years later, actually when I started teaching in Fresno. And I don't know if anybody might remember. There might be some people there's nobody my age, but some people almost my age remember the social scene, especially on the West Coast in the late 60s and early 70s. There was a lot of dope being smoked in those days. And so I said, well, let me try to do a sort of a mystical approach. I mean, it was partly fueled by a book that I read into on Tantra art. I misread the book. I went back to the book and read it more properly, but I misread it at the time. And I saw, that the tantric monks they would meditate and produce works of art from meditation. And so I said, well, let me do that. But I thought, well, the meditate means to sit in my living room, and smoke a joint, and turn John Coltrane's Love Supreme up as loud as it could get. And I did that, and and another miracle happened. At a certain point, I saw sheep running across my living room, and I said, "Wow, that I'm looking at my ego. I'm looking at my subjectivity." And so I ran over and made some mandala type paintings. Probably the worst paintings ever executed in the history of the world. Fortunately, none of those paintings survived, but I knew that wasn't going to work. I should preface this is that this problem I was having with feeling an identity with my own product is just something that's an issue with me. It's because I'm not really arguing either from my work or even from this speech that there is sort of this new way of making art, or that that everybody should regard their subjectivities as the enemy and start some kind of revolutionary campaign. It's just it was, and I have no idea why it was a problem for me, but it only applies to me, not to. I'm not talking about a theory of art or suggesting a sort of a general practice that people should undertake. So when I was in graduate school, I got turned on to a couple of books. One was a book on tantric art by Ajit Mukherjee. I told you about that book before. And the other was Henri Faucillon, The Life of Forms in Art. There was a guy who was a curator from the Guggenheim who was actually taking courses in the program that came to my studio, and for the life of me, I couldn't understand. I can't see why he thought the paintings in my studio were interesting, but he thought it was interesting enough for him to suggest that I do some reading and some research reflective of what was going on at the current time. And interestingly enough, Faucillon was a writer that was being read by artists. This is back in the 60s. And of course, we all know this interest in Asian ideology, Asian philosophy, Buddhist philosophy. So the book on tantric art was sort of was a natural thing. I had a natural interest, and he suggested that I read that and look at the pictures. And so I did. I mean, one of the things that interested me, and it was revealing, one of the things that interested me, particularly, well, with the Faucillon, is that, in case you don't know who he is, he's the leading historian on Renaissance and classical European art. He wrote a book called The Life of Forms in Art. And it was a book. It wasn't a history book. It really wasn't a theory book. It was a book where he tried to explain what doing art history was. And one of the things he said about the process of doing art history, one of the things he said was that the responsibility of the historian was to recreate the conditions of art at the time of its making. Notwithstanding the fact that, of course, the historian is operating hundreds and perhaps years later sometimes. But try to do that, and with respect to that, he raised some ideas about the what you call the reciprocal fitness of matter, the sense of matter having a life of its own. That was the first time I saw a discussion of art where there was a consideration of art that was taken outside of the realm of subjectivity. That matter had a life of its own. So there would be behaviors and the material that you used, he said, that would influence the product that you made that was not a product of your subjectivity. And it sort of looked like chance or indeterminacy in operation. A lot of theorists try to describe that as intuition. But he specifically said it wasn't something that was generated from one's subjective position. It was something that was social and cultural, that was operating on its own, and it informed the work that you made. So that was really interesting to me, that there was a way of looking at work where something else was operating and determining what was made. I mean, later on, I ran into that same principle with John Cage and his theory of indeterminacy. The tantric art book was particularly interesting. I realized that, notwithstanding Phocion, that in order to try to address this issue of subjectivity, that I had to look outside of Western art. And so the tantric book gave me a global view, where I discovered that the artist who made what everybody recognizes as works of art made it from a sort of a rigorous discipline of meditation, contemplation, and so the images that were produced not only came from that rigor, but they popped up in different subjectivities. In other words, two different monks could paint the same image or be part of the same language of images because of what was being driven or determined, what I imagine by the effect of a certain kind of mental rigor upon their brain that can't be explained by the Western notions of the subject. But nevertheless, there were something that were, sculpture and paintings. There were works of art. So I thought, well, that was interesting. That what I need to do is to find something that would allow a practice to operate not based upon, by bypassing my subjectivity. And I said, well, what can I do? First, I have to admit that was my first adventure into listening to John Coltrane at painful levels. I thought that that might be the Western equivalent of Zen meditation, but of course it wasn't. And so I thought, well, what else can I do? And then I had the fortune of running into a Hannah Darbovin, not one but three exhibitions in New York, happening at three galleries: John Weber, Leo Castelli, and a major show at the Modern. And so it was interesting because it's an exhibition that really bothered me. Now, Hannah Darbovin's work is not really systematic, but what interested me was, first of all, how the importance of drawing as a medium. That like I didn't really have to make paintings. So and also. There must have been maybe 500 drawings in these three locations, and I couldn't tell the difference between one from the other. I mean, and at a certain point, after spending, like a certain amount of hours trying to study the work, I got mad. Why should, like all of those normal things that you're supposed to experience when you look at a work of art, like this sort of orgiastic sense of a new reality, this pleasure that comes over you, this deep insight into culture, all that stuff. Like none of that happened, and so I got mad at the work, but I couldn't get the work out of my mind. And eventually I said, well, there must be something important about that. Somehow, I got to the idea of whatever I do to work this out has to be through drawing. And so I decided that the equivalent of Darbovin's repetition was system. Now, the work wasn't systematic, but you can see that the repetition was a kind of grid. So that I began to think that, well, maybe I should use numbers and mathematics to develop a system. And that's really where it started. Is there an image with my beautiful name? Is this something that happens from down here? Or should I do slide view?
Yeah, does that work for you, Charles?
Oh, there you go.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of these.
Uh-oh, that's mine. It has all the fingerprints on it. This, so that led to the working with the numbers and grids. The earliest pieces I'm not showing you. I'm showing you at the time of a particular a project which is called Walnut Tree Orchard. And you see on this side, this is version 1 and this is version 2. So, and version 1, it said 75, but actually started that series in 73. And the second version was simply, a continuation of the first, but using the same photographic sources. I'll explain that in a minute. But generally, what I did in order to do this work was that I took a camera and went to a walnut tree orchard out in Fresno, just outside of the city, and photographed the trees on the orchard. Already, at that point I was thinking of images as looking at them as things that can be analyzed or be sort of imaged within some kind of system that I can apply the grid to their consideration. And when I looked at the orchard, it was, it was a perfect model of that, because orchards are they're grids. And it appealed to me to this idea that was an early part of my interest, which is this sort of Platonic notion of the concept and its example, or the idea and its example in the world. So that, for example, the idea of a tree is something that exists in the mind, but the examples of trees exist in the world. But when you look at those trees, they have a sort of a variety to them. They're different. No, there's no individual tree that stands as the ideal tree that exists in the mind, as a category tree. And so when I saw all the trees laid out in the orchard, it said that all of them are trying to be this single tree, but they're all different from each other. And so I can register and make note of these of that there's a contradiction, but it's a binary, the one against the many. I can make note of that by creating a situation where that was essentially based upon their differences. That the single thing that is constitutively different, at least that they're each one constitutively different from the other, but at the same time existing in the same category. So what I did was that I photographed these trees, and version 1 I photographed 27 of them, and actually it took more, but I used 27 for my work, and I decided that the way I was going to use them is that I was going to plot their shapes on top of each other, one at a time, and do that until all 27 trees were plotted on top of each other. Plotting means that as you could see, as you're supposed to see in this drawing. I mean, I know you can't see anything. You just have to take my word for it. Plotting it means is that I would take the silhouette, the silhouette shape of the tree, and project it on a grid and fill the grid in with numbers. The numbers would form as an aggregate the shape of the tree. And by molecularizing the tree or atomizing the tree this way, I would be able to make a record of their shapes consecutively in a series and keep prominent the individual trees, even though they're laid and plotted on top of each other. So that ideally, you could find not only the first tree, if you look at the 27th tree, you can find in the 27th tree the first tree, as well as the 27th tree. I decided to use the triptych format to be a literal articulation of how the system works. So this idea was implanted in me that nothing should be given to subjectivity, that there should be a reason and a function for every part of what we would call an image. So the triptych displays the process of its creation. The middle tree is a line drawing from the photograph, and then in the way that I made this, I projected the line drawing onto the grid and then filled the space with numbers. And then I did that with the second tree. What you can't see, you have to take my word for it, is that in order to differentiate, to some sort of categorical differentiation, I changed the color of the second tree. In fact, I used 5 colors in this process, which are applied in a loop. In this case, the second tree is a blue tree, so there are blue numbers on there. So where the black numbers are, it's the first tree, and the blue numbers is the tree you see in the photograph. And then I did it with the third tree, where I redrew the secondary drawing, and then I plotted the shape of the third tree on top of that, and the third numbers are red. And I did this throughout the system, throughout the series, by one at a time, numbers plotting the shape of the tree. The numbers, there's no meaning to the numbers. Well, specifically, I mean, I think that they, or provocatively, metaphorically, but the numbers are, again, a systematic tool that helps and allows for the transfer of the image from one drawing to another. They run zeros vertically up the middle of the grid, and they count out progressively 1 to whatever number, 56, from center left, and 1 to 56 to center right. So each square of the grid has a predetermined number, so that when I project the tree onto the grid, I can record the shape in that space with the number. It is the number that helps me locate where the shape should go in the first place. So I kept doing this process, and slowly see, I don't have all 27 trees here, but I have like 16, I think. And incidentally, this is the version 2 that you're seeing. It's not the version 1. The version 1, half of version 1 disappeared due to, I'm going to say, this is where I can use my poor black child raised in the racist South excuse. Yeah, maybe it doesn't work here, but I'll use it several times tonight, I'll tell you. But nobody told me about archiving, and so suddenly I'm having these major shows, with this work, And the dealer said, "Oh, don't worry about it. We'll keep records of everything." And I said, "All right, And so eventually both galleries closed down. I lost work, I would see work would pop up here and there that was improperly, purchased, quote unquote. So the original series is incomplete. I can't find them all. But so that encouraged me to do this second series. It's not a copy of the first series because the sequence of trees is different. But it is the reason why I did it. So ultimately, in this series, this is 16 trees, but in the original, it was 27. And it got to a point, I made this arbitrary rule that I will stop the series once all the squares are filled in and what is, it's called known as the crown. And at a certain point, I began to realize that I don't think that's ever going to happen. So then there's an arbitrary. What I found out that the beginning is not necessarily arbitrary. The beginning is consummate with the idea of the work. And so, to whatever degree my own sort of creative imagination is employed, it is to invent the idea of the work in the first place. But how the work is deployed is always dependent on the system. And once the deployment happens, then there's no logical place where a work can stop or needs to stop. It's really arbitrary, which made me more aware of the idea of the arbitrariness of the system. Some people think that, well, I'm being hyper rational and logical and reducing image to, such terms. But what I found out in making the work is that what happens is that you become aware, and this is a photograph of the installation at the Hammer. What happens is that you become aware that ultimately visuality works this way, that what we see is an aggregate of matter. When we give name to that aggregate, but we see it as an aggregate of matter. But all you have to do is get a microscope and see that they're just like particles that you're looking at. And I realized that there's a huge gap between the individual particles that make up an image and the image that is aggregated from the particles. It's a huge gap. I mean, there's no logical jump from one to the other. I mean, it's sort of like thinking about the space between moments, between seconds of the clock. That you can subdivide that space infinitely, like infinitely. So there's no point where second one turns to second two. By the time you get to second two, you're already there. But there's no that getting there is not rationally determined. So ultimately, for me it was interesting because it reinforced the idea of this is a part of representation, that there's a sort of a cultural force that's operating that informs us of how to aggregate these particles. Like tree, which is a concept. That's how we aggregate those particles, from the idea of tree. But how you get that idea of tree from, sort of what I'm calling particles, I don't know what else to call it, like who knows. So I was particularly interested in this issue of the arbitrary, the issue of the random as a consequence of this, in spite of the fact that these things are systematically produced. So then in 2016, I'm going to show you, actually in the middle 80s, I started a group of works called Numbers and Trees. Essentially, Numbers and Trees, it's a continuation of the gridded tree drawings. They're produced in exactly the same way. The only difference is that they're more complexly produced, because I always have trouble. It's really hard for me to say that I returned to using paint. It's really, I'm still not over it. So that is, I started to fill the squares not with just numbers but with color, but it included numbers too. But otherwise, it's produced the same way. Here's some installation shots from the Paula Cooper's gallery show that I had 4 years ago in New York. What I did for this show are 8 of these very large flexi boxes. They are 12 feet wide and 8 feet high. And similarly, like for example, you see the two images of the two objects in this corner. The red tree that you see is a plotted image of a tree that's in the photograph in the back behind it. It's so that you can tell the relevant tree because it's the central image in the photo, and then its shape is plotted on top of that in numbers, but also in coloring the squares of the grid. And then to the right of that is the second tree plotted on top of this. So this first plexi is reproduced in order to make the second plexi box. And once I do that, then we plot the shape of the second tree. It's simply by, using the color of the second tree, in this case, plotting it, and in some cases, the color of the second tree occupies squares that are unoccupied. In other cases, it's occupied by the first tree. And so there's some color mixing going on in this process that's also produced by the system. So this is the first tree. The second, with the blue tree on top of the red, and then the third was the green tree on top of the other two. There's a violet tree, and then a kind of a amber tree on top for number 5. This is number 7. Number 8, and then number 9, I think this is. And what happens in this series is that you have this issue of color. And one of the comments that went on during the time that I was doing the drawings is that that there was a kind of an aesthetic to the drawing itself. There's a certain kind of lacy delicacy that people thought belied the fact that the piece was done systematically. But in fact, I was very much interested in that aspect of it because this was part of my interrogation of the subject. That is that I'm making images that's produced by a system. In other words, it's deployed by a system. So I'm trying to make the distinction between my invention of the idea and its deployment. And since it's deployed by a system, there's the assumption then it should be like boring or literal or something like that. And when it reads poetically, that's experienced by people as sort of a paradox. And the reason why people, well, I'll get into that in a minute. So when we get to the colors and one of the reasons why I had trouble, going to painting and dealing with colors is simply because colors are so highly emotionally charged, and I thought that it might steer people away from the critical issues of the representation to a certain kind of sort of visual pleasure and experience of visual pleasure. So because colors are that way, but I ultimately thought that maybe there's some way that I can contain that, some way that I can use that, so that if in the final analysis there is an affect produced by, both on the level of the form and the color, that would operate as a certain critique of representation. Because conventionally, the affect that's produced by form in works of art is attributed to the success of the imagination of the artist through the artist's effort at expression. That is, that the act of expression makes a conduit, it's believed, between the artist's subjectivity and the subjectivity of any viewer, that there's a communication operating on those levels, and that's why there's affect. Affect is an experience in art. It's why it's thought to be sort of purely visual in this case. I mean, there's different kinds of affects, but and so I thought that, well, if I can get the same results but with a system, then I could show that you don't need the ego, and you don't need the art, the imagination, the artist's imagination, in order to produce these kinds of aesthetic and emotional experiences. So that was the purpose. I mean, what I'm saying is that, like the purpose of these things, or the dealing with visuality and representation, is not to make objects of pleasure, but to make critical objects that question the issue, some of the assumptions that we have about what the experience of art actually is, and where that experience takes place in our cognitive and feeling apparati. This is some close-ups. Yeah, so then, this is a partial representation of the series I did for the ICA Miami, a commission that has been up for a year there. It's a series of 5 street pieces that, again, using a strategy that I did in the 80s, but decided to pick up again. And in this case, it's rather than using the photograph of the tree in the rear, we do an exploded painting of the tree, exploded gridded painting of the tree that is the same tree that's plotted in the grid. The space between the grid and the background is about 3.5 inches. So it's 3.5. It's 3 or 4.5. What is it, Kristen? 3.5. All right. Yeah. Everybody's saying, "Who the hell's Kristen?" So the space is that much. Now, in this series, which you can't see very well, the tree in the front acts as a stencil that. For example, the numbers in the tree that's in the front are also in the back. Where those numbers fall in the exploded image, those spaces are not colored in. It's just colors. It's just numbers. You can't see it in this situation, but if you were there and you looked in the side, you will see, the numbers transferred from the front to the back, and it almost looks like the exploded image of the tree acts as a stencil that overlays the front image. This is in the kind of weird reversal. So these are fairly large pieces. I think they're more than 6 feet. Or at least, no, they're not quite, like 5.5 feet tall. Yeah, so that work, which I refer to as the grid work, I mean, that's what I have to show you with respect to that series of works. And as I said, I want to show you the work that I started doing in the mid-90s that deals with a language. Essentially, I don't have an image of it, but a piece that I did called Night Crimes, which I also did in the 90s. It's a good illustration of how I decided to deal with the issue of language. In that series, I found a photograph from the crime archives of the LA Times, a crime scene, and a photograph of a convicted felon of a capital crime. And then I had a bunch of night sky images, very high quality images. This is before digital photography became dominant, so they're analog images of the night sky. So what I did was that I found out the date of the crime. And I had the photograph of the crime scene represent that date. And then I put a murderer next to it in another photograph. And then I put the photograph of the night sky that was present at the moment that that murder took place. And that is to say that at the time of the murder, if the victim or the perpetrator looked up, they would have seen this part of the night sky and that part of LA at that time of the night. If the crime took place in the day, then you wouldn't be able to see it, but the stars were still there. It's just that it's too much light. And making that triadic relation was provocative. Everything in that piece was a lie. The only thing that wasn't a lie was that it was a real, those photographs were archivally accurate. But their associations, were implications, they were inferred, but not true. The criminal didn't commit the crime. The night sky there was not real night sky that they saw, but only an estimation of what it would look like. Since the night sky is cyclical, is an estimation of what it would have looked like. We'll say 50 years later on the crime, or projecting back what it might have looked like at that time, even though we were 50, 60 years from that moment. And there was an inevitable desire to form a narrative connecting these images. And on top of that, it made sense. At the same time, you know that the narrative you're producing is a fiction. And at the very least, you can say that it was sort of poetic narrative. It was that kind of fiction, and attributed to this again, the subjectivity of the artists, the poetics of the artist. But we know that those the archives are not inventions. The point that I was trying to get to in that piece, the critique that I was trying to get to, is that those connections that we make, which I refer to as metonymic and metaphor connections, are a pure product of your cultural learning. And then so there's a tendency then to see things that are already embedded in you as new material, new representations, new narrative, new feelings, all those things, because you're sort of convinced of the linkage or the connection between the photographs. So that represents what I tended to do. I tended to take things that are unrelated, put them together, and in full face of the fact that they have their relationship is arbitrary, engaged the experience, the compelling experience of their relationship, that they somehow not only related, but their relationship is meaningful, and struggle with that because one understands that it's at the same time sort of a paradox that you. I mean, I think it's not far from astrology. I mean, some people think astrology is real, and I don't think it's real, but I sure enjoy reading astrology charts. Somehow it makes a certain amount of sense. I did a piece recently, an app. I created an app called the App of Changes. It was sort of modeled after the I Ching, except I don't know if you know what the I Ching is, but it's an ancient text that, due to a very specific system of application, you could ask it questions and invoke chance in order to get the answers to your question. And so I did something like that, but instead of having the various descriptions that the I Ching makes, that when collated as under those hexagrams, forms a meaningful answer to you. Instead of doing that, I collected 300 aphoristic phrases of the major thinkers from the last 2,000 years in the world, literature, And so when you use the app, you ask it a question, and then you get an answer. And but the answer is an arbitrary selection of one of the 300 aphoristic phrases. And it's like really weird how appropriate some of these answers are. Yeah, and you can't help but to enjoy it because you know that there's no secret hand guiding the question, the answer to the question. It's just random, but it makes so much sense. The way I started looking at it is that it makes sense to the degree that the arbitrary or the random system allows you to get to think about something in a way that you would otherwise never think about. Because of the effort to make sense between the question and the answer. It forces you to go outside of your ego rather than exist within your ego in terms of interpreting the answer. So that kind of randomness is operating. So in the case of this piece, librettos, this is similar. I took two archival objects. I think I'll make it. One is an opera from that Emmanuel Defier wrote called Life is Short. And that's one archive. And you could see that because the libretto of Life is Short is printed, those are plexi boxes like the trees. The libretto is printed on the face of the plexi. And behind the plexi boxes is a Stokely Carmichael text. It was his first Black Power speech that he gave in the state of Washington, a matter of fact. And so simply I conflated the two archives. I put the opera libretto in front of the archive, in front of the Carmichael speech. And in order to engage the piece, you have to consider both sources, that they interlink. If you want to see what Stokely said, you have to see it through the music. If you want to pay attention to the music, Stokely's speech is like hovering in the background. And so that you couldn't consider the work without dealing with the effect of both of those archives. And so I don't know, a little shout out to Stokely Carmichael. I don't know if you've been reading the last time you've read Stokely's speeches, but they are some of the most remarkable political speeches I've ever read. And it's really interesting because Stokely spoke often in Black colloquial expression in order to because the audience is dealing with it, in order to maintain a certain kind of link or a kinship with the audience. But his use of and I remember at the time people who were mostly not Black denigrated his speech, saying that because it said it's not sophisticated, it's political text, it's it's sort of improper use of language and so forth. But now years go by and like almost everybody recognizes some of the most powerful political speech that anybody's ever done, and it's remarkably beautiful. And so that has a certain kind of power behind it, and if you get invested in the speech, it hits you hard, it knocks you off your feet. I mean, when showing this piece, I get emails from people accusing me of racism, because of the things that they think I said. And I said, no, I didn't say these things. Stokely Carmichael said it. I didn't say these things. But it really hits, the speech still has this great power. So that power is sort of combined, I think, with the power of the opera. In any way, when they're put together, what I suspect, like I said, the words of the speech and the notations and words that's in the opera somehow seem to come together, as a kind of duet in a certain sense. For example, some of the ideas that might be expressed in the speech come up, fall in places of the libretto, where you would think that, that the libretto in some way is analogizing or metaphorizing a concept that's in the speech, and vice versa. For example, there's a figure in music called a triple forte, and it's three Fs right next to each other. And so you might get to a part of the text where Stokely is making some really adamant remark, like a fist pounding remark with a period at the end. And you notice that that remark, in front of the remark, is the triple forte insignia, that kind of sign, making you think that forming the relationship, the power of the statement, and triple forte means it's supposed to be loud and grandiose. These kind of little things happen in the work, in a field where generally nothing happens. I mean, when I say nothing happens, that it doesn't, that often those kind of moments, in other words, those moments aren't constant in the work. They sort of weave in and out of the work, or weave through the work as you go through the series. What I did in the series is to get from the FIA archives the actual handwritten first generation music from the opera. And Manuel de Falla is a composer, a Spanish composer that you all know. There's a very famous and popular piece in this opera that I'm not going to sing to you, so you can stop worrying. But you would all know. So it's very. And I decided, we were talking about the length of works. I decided that this piece would last as long as there are pages from the archive. And right now we're about 3/4 through the piece. We still have some pages to work with in order for the speech, for the piece to be completed. And we're on the second Carmichael speech in this piece. Geez. About 36, 34 by 40 each. And we show them as diptychs, of course. All right, so the last work I want to talk about is the Manifestos Series, and this is the Manifestos. I'm showing you a piece called Manifestos 2. The Manifestos Series was the first opportunity. I was trained as a musician, and I never saw the opportunity of where I can use that training in my studio practice. But in some miraculous way, through the Manifesto Series, it happened for the first time. The way that this piece is realized, and Manifestos 2 is an installation. It starts out by, let's see, I got to ask the question. It's 7:35 now, so that gives me what? 10 minutes? Well, actually no, but I'll have to abbreviate this, okay? Because we got to get to the music, right? So I'm going to give you a really abbreviated description. But essentially, I take I find 4 political texts. I translate the texts into musical notation using a system where the letters A through G are translated into the notes A through G. And then I also try to make letter H B flat, which is a Baroque tradition of this tradition. It's just systematic idea is not new. So we take that music, score it for an ensemble, do a recording, and match that recording to the particular manifesto that generated it. So you see there are 4 manifestos here, and each one generated its own music. The scores I turned that it comes from. We turn into large drawings, and I'll show you a close up. And if you have the time, you can actually track how the music produced, the letters produced the notes. The top line is just the melody line, and so they correspond to the letters in the text. And the bottom line is the harmony, where I have a system that takes each word and have a chord accompaniment of each word, and that chord to sustain the length of the word. So what I'm going to do is show you the video. We won't be able to see it all, but you can see some of it. The video is about 13 minutes long, but I'm going to stop it at about 10 minutes, okay? sound down. Yeah. Well, it's scrolling. Just so that you know what's happening. You could have the sound, but low. Yeah. So you know what's happening. The trumpet is carrying the melody line. So those are the notes that come from the text. The length of the trumpet, the length of time that the trumpet holds a note depends upon when the next note is made, or when. And then the quartet behind it is playing the chords underneath, and the chords are realized by taking the first letter in the word, that's a note, and converting that to a chord. So if we have the word, I don't know, apple, then the first letter is an A, and then an A major chord accompanies that, and the string quartet plays that. Where there's license, this was done with the help of Sean Griffin, who's a composer. He made the arrangement from my piano score for the ensemble. And what I told him is that you can color the piece any way that you want, you know, emphasis and so forth, but you can't change any note. You can't add notes or take notes away. So the emotion that the piece carries is informed heavily by the tempo we decided to choose and the way he plays with coloration. Right? But he's constrained because he can't sort of invent phrases. He has to deal with what he's given. I make a point of this because one of the biggest debates that I have when I give these lectures is about what people think as certain subjective decisions that I make which belie my claim that I'm working from a system. So my argument about that, which convinces nobody but me, is that the framework is the structure, that you can't go outside of the structure, outside of the system. You can do any number of things within it, like if it's a low A or a high A, that's, you can choose that, but you can't do a B note. And so the idea that you have choices doesn't mean you're being expressive. You see, that's my argument, because the idea of expression is an entirely different set of terms that have to do with operating from the unknown of the subjectivity or the unknown of the unconscious. And so that's the argument I give, and then, you know, people say, they tell me that I'm full of it, but that's okay. So that's really it. You can phase out the music. I don't think we have time for any questions, do we? Do we? Okay. All right.
Hello, thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask why walnut trees? Had they struck you as a particularly graphic subject? Was it deliberate or was it random? And if it was random, could it have been anything else that was spindly or twiggy?
Yeah, I mean, I've done several pieces with using plants, so they're not all trees. But the reason the tree was interesting to me is because of the deciduous tree is easily graphable. I needed an open form. It's because I was interested in layering the image. And the deciduous tree, it was useful because you can layer that image on top of each other and you can see the record of branches through the layers. I had used opaque forms in other works, and so I've done that and with other intentions with regard to that. But that's why the tree was an important image to me. The walnut tree was chance. I was driving down the freeway and saw the orchard. But it just so happens that the walnut orchard trees are heavily pruned, so they're very open forms. There are some types of fruit trees that are not open, they're much more sort of dense. They're the same photographs, but in a different order. And also the pieces, the scale is a little different. The images are 24 by 30 in the second one. The original one was 16 by 20. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. You mentioned particles as a way of thinking about the matter in your work, and I was wondering if you've ever thought of those particles as pixels, and if those pixels for you are attached to any kind of way in which
I'm losing you on the second part of the question.
I'm wondering if you've ever thought of your work in terms of pixels, and because you mentioned particles, and so when I think of pixels, I also think of like screen space or virtual space, and I was wondering if you've ever thought about your work in that context.
Yeah, well, when I did the original series, pixel was a word. But I never associated these with digital imagery. At the time, it's digitized imagery in the 70s, in the early 70s, is not as common, or even in the 80s, is not as common in our ordinary experiences as it is today. So the grid was really, I used the word, particles, but the grid was really a geometric figure. I was really using it as geometry, and as a way of mathematically dividing a form like a tree. That was the way I looked at it at the time. It was a geometric incursion into a natural form of nature in that way. Also, the idea. Some people have asked, why didn't I have it done by a machine? Like why did I do it? And of course, there were computers who could produce digital images in those days. Admittedly, I was born during the time that the stagecoach was invented, but that was really something that was possible, technically possible, but practically impossible. It would have cost literally millions of dollars to produce that piece if I tried to do it, with a machine. Now it's a piece of cake. I can do it in my studio, but I don't. Do we have any other questions?
I have a question. So it's around the question of archiving, and you're like, I'm a poor black child from down south, and I feel you on that. What exactly do we do? Like, especially us just being like, a broke artist, like we barely have a room ourselves, and then all of a sudden we're supposed to store like 24 paintings there. Also, the question of like archiving and keeping things, and also dealing with the fact that there's like part of your ephemera that like you really just have to let go of. Like a part of your history is like being lost. Like how do you deal with?
When you say let go of, could you clarify that?
Sometimes you can give it, like sometimes you can have something stored at, I don't know, anywhere, and I don't know, what if they lose?
So you asking me how have I got around to storing all of the objects that I've made over the last 100 years?
How do you deal with storing them, and how do you deal with the fact that some stuff that you have stored has been lost, or like you can't find it because they were supposed to archive it?
I've been fortunate. I've had gallery representations who stored the predominance of my work, and that happened fairly early. I started showing 5 years out of graduate school, 6 years out of graduate school. So I had the store. So the store was never really a problem for me. I mean, where I worked, I also had some space where I could store pieces as I work on them. But I had help with storage, and so I regard myself as lucky that way. Because I would know what to do if I had to store a lot of the work that I accumulated during a certain number of years. I couldn't afford to store them. I don't know what to do. In fact, one of the problems that happened is that one of the galleries that represented me closed, went bankrupt, and I had a large body of work in their storage unit. I couldn't get the work because in order to get the work out of their unit, I had to pay the storage fee that the gallery didn't pay, and I didn't have the money to pay it. So years went by, and that storage place closed down, and the people who worked there helped themselves to the art. So that work got disappeared. This is what happens when you're a poor artist. I was trying to figure out, is this a good time to use my poor black artist, living in the racist South? But no, it doesn't work there. I haven't had the chance to use that excuse in this lecture. I'm so upset. But use it. But yeah, so I couldn't get the work, and that work is lost. There have been periods where some of it has surfaced. For example, when the Studio Museum retrospective was organized, the museum did a search for missing pieces, and they found some. And we retrieved a few pieces, but mostly that those pieces are lost forever. As I said early on, if you're a young artist, you have to think about, first of all, don't, almost all artists throw stuff away. I'm telling you, don't throw anything away, and find some way to store it in your grandmother's attic or something. You just got to find some place to keep that work.
We have one more question for you up here.
Hi. I'm noticing a parallel between your number plotting system and your earlier interest in tantric art and Buddhist visual philosophies, particularly with mandala paintings, which can be highly systematic. It reminds me of the iconometric canons of Tibetan Buddhist drawings and paintings. What I am wondering is if the desire for non-subjectivity in your visual language mirrors the idea of ego death in Buddhist teachings, and do you think political work can maintain non-subjective integrity?
Jeez. Where do I start? The influence of Buddhist ideology is there. I mean, the idea of the problems with the concept of the ego, I appropriated that to talk about the failure of the focus on this, the expressive subject, in the sense that I thought that if you operated from your own psychology, you tend to only repeat what you know. And so there has to be a more objective relationship with the world for unusual ideas, truly unusual ideas to become possible, and so a lot of that, and at the time I was telling you that the United States, a lot of people had an interest in Buddhist philosophy in the 60s and the 70s. So my problem with that interest was that it was like what was going on with the way Africa was influenced on early European modernism. That division was maintained. That you have Western ideas of Western early modernist ideas like the cage and so forth, which was thought to be not as sophisticated in terms of works of art as the non-Western models, and so I had a problem with that kind of imperialist thinking with regard to these things. But nevertheless, that's a risk that you take if you're a Westerner and you're dealing with ideologies that are non-Western. You don't want to appropriate them in an imperialistic fashion, but it's a risky thing. That's why I was trying to find a way of working from the standpoint of my own experiences, and from the standpoint of that value in terms of doing political work. I have the position that that identity is crucial. Has to be crucially maintained to make political narratives meaningful and meaningful to people. But the idea that I have of identity is different from the idea I have from subjectivity. The idea of identity is that that identity is a political construct. It's culturally constructed. It's essentially necessary in order for agency. And but the way I find that I can use it, that I can preserve that idea in my work and still be critical of the idea of subjectivity, is to suggest that suggest that identity, essentially this idea that identity is a social construct that's politically determined. So if I identify myself as a black person, and I have a politics around that, about that blackness, and somebody asks me the question, is your work dealing with your identity as a black person? So I say yes, because in my own view, I can understand how my experiences as a black person evolved into making the work that I make. Essentially, my and it's because I can do that because I learned that my identity is a function, is a consequence of my circumstances. Like where I grew up in Charleston, and my mother told me that when we on walks, she'd ask me why were things the way they were, so so it was 4 years old or something, and I'd ask her, why is that a chicken? Why is that a tree? And then at some point it said, when I die, could I come back as a bird? So what was going on there is that was informing me about the identity of things was my awareness, even as a 4-year-old, of the Jim Crow laws of the South, where a whole set of terms and conditions were attached to me. What was permissible as a black person, and what was not permissible. That I had to drink out of certain fountains. I couldn't ride in front of the bus, and all those things. And it mystified me as a young person why those rules were attached to me as a black person. I realized that those rules equaled my identity. I realized that there was a construction, and the great thing about the civil rights movement is that the identity of being black, like Stokely Carmichael's essays, the idea of being black was reinvented by the civil rights movement, particularly the work of Stokely, and so the issue of my experience as a black person in my work is that I recognize my identity in these sort of speculative questions about representation. That is, as I said before, that why things are called what they are ultimately is arbitrary. The issue, and I'm trying to prove that arbitrariness in the work, because that feeds into what I'm talking about. How that's my political attitude about identity, how identity works. Now that's different from subjectivity, because I have problems with identifying blackness as a kind of subject, because that leads to essentialist discourse. Like there's some kind of sort of absolute notion of blackness or whiteness or Asian and so forth that goes beyond cultural influence, cultural formation. I have a problem with that, and I have a problem with art that projects that kind of political narrative. I think, is that it? We finished?